The Virulent Nihilism of Nick Land, From Libidinal Materialism to the Dark Enlightenment 1. Introduction, The Landian Singularity. The intellectual trajectory of Nick Land stands as one of the most enigmatic, volatile, and theoretically dense arcs in contemporary continental philosophy. From his emergence as a charismatic and unorthodox lecturer at the University of Warwick in the 1990s to his controversial resurrection as a progenitor of the neo-reactionary, NRX, Dark Enlightenment, in Shanghai, Land's work traces a rigorous, if terrifying, line of flight away from the human subject. His corpus is not merely a collection of philosophical texts but a performative operation, theory fiction, that seeks to accelerate the dissolution of the human into the machinery of capital, cybernetics, and cosmic trauma. To engage with Land is to grapple with a thinker who views philosophy not as a mechanism for moral edification, social critique, or the preservation of human dignity, but as a form of intellectual terrorism, or philosophical viruses, designed to dismantle the security systems of the self. His work posits that the human is a temporary, stabilizing drag on the inevitable acceleration of intelligence, an intelligence that is fundamentally alien, machinage, and destined to supersede its biological hosts. Land's influence spans the development of speculative realism, the aesthetic theory of geotrauma, the concept of hyperstition, and the polarized political descendants of accelerationism, the socialist left accelerationism, LACC, and the authoritarian right accelerationism, RACC. This report provides an exhaustive examination of Land's thought, structured to mirror the chronological and conceptual evolution of his virus. It dissects his radical readings of Georges Bataille and Immanuel Kant during the Warwick years, his pivotal and esoteric work with the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, CCRU, his descent into madness and subsequent disappearance, and his controversial return as a theorist of techno-commercial authoritarianism. By tracing the continuity of anti-humanism across these seemingly disparate phases, the analysis reveals a singular, terrifying coherency, a commitment to the outside, regardless of the cost to the human species. 2. The Warwick Years, Virulent Nihilism and the Death of Sound Philosophy. In the early 1990s, the philosophy department at the University of Warwick became the incubator for a radical mutation in British continental philosophy. While the mainstream academy was preoccupied with the linguistic turn, the careful exegesis of Derrida, or the historicism of Foucault, Land and his cohort, including Sadie Plant, initiated a project that sought to fuse philosophy with the intensity of rave culture, cybernetics, and the occult. This period was defined by a rejection of the sclerosis of academic writing in favor of a delirious style that aimed to channel the forces it described. 2.1. The Thirst for Annihilation, A Declaration of War. Land's first and only academic monograph, The Thirst for Annihilation, Georges Bataille and Virulent Nihilism, 1992, serves as the foundational text for his entire intellectual project. Though nominally a study of the French thinker Georges Bataille, the text is, in practice, a machine for the demolition of sound philosophy. 2.1.1. Critique of Kantian Restraint and the Great Indoors. Land identifies Immanuel Kant as the ultimate adversary of radical thought. Kant's critical philosophy is characterized by Land as a defensive fortification, a mechanism designed to limit reason to the realm of possible experience, phenomena, thereby protecting the human subject from the overwhelming chaos of the noumena, the thing in itself. Land argues that academic philosophy since Kant has been an exercise in phenomenology, which he derides as the study of the great indoors, a safe, domesticated space of human experience that actively suppresses the outside. In The Thirst for Annihilation, Land attempts to breach these Kantian defenses. He rejects the conceptual hygiene of standard scholarship in favor of a libidinal materialism that treats thought as an excretion of base matter. Philosophy, for Land, should not be a distinct, elevated discourse but a conduit for the same energetic forces that drive biological decay and solar expenditure. He posits that the Kantian firewall is permeable and that the thirst for destruction is the feeling of the noumena leaking through. 2.1.2. The Solar Economy and the Necessity of Waste. Drawing heavily on Bataille's concept of general economy, Land posits that the fundamental problem of existence is not scarcity, as maintained by classical economics and survivalist biology, but excess. The sun gifts the earth with more energy than it can possibly absorb or utilize. This excess energy must be expended, spent, and if it is not spent gloriously in art, eroticism, or ritual sacrifice, it will be spent catastrophically in war and destruction. Land radicalizes this by stripping away Bataille's lingering humanism. Where Bataille arguably sought a form of community or communion in expenditure, Land sees only a violent impulse to escape. He conceptualizes a solar economy, where the inevitable trajectory of all matter is toward dissolution and death. This is virulent nihilism, not a passive resignation to meaninglessness, but an active, ferocious investment in the destruction of order. He writes of a thirst for annihilation that is not a negation of desire, but desire in its purest, most intense form, a desire for the end of the self. The solar is not a life-giving force in the benevolent sense, but a curse of overwhelming energy that demands the liquidation of terrestrial structures. 2.2. Deleuze and the mad line of flight. If Bataille provided the energetic engine for Land's philosophy, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari provided the steering mechanism, or rather, the mechanism for destroying the steering. Land's reading of Anti-Oedipus is notoriously selective, intense, and devoid of political caution. He ignores the guarded aspects of Deleuze's work, focusing entirely on deterritorialization, the process of dismantling social, psychic, and biological structures. Land interprets capitalism not as a system to be critiqued or overcome by socialism, but as the ultimate engine of deterritorialization. For the Land of the 1990s, capitalism is a machinage process that strips away archaic traditions, family structures, and eventually the human form itself. He famously chided transcendental miserablists, traditional leftists, for wanting to slow down this process. Instead, Land advocated accelerating the process, pushing the market's corrosive logic to its limit to reach the body without organs, a state of pure, undifferentiated fluidity. This interpretation birthed the mad Deleuzian archetype, a philosopher who does not merely study schizophrenia as a clinical category but attempts to induce schizoanalysis, in reality, breaking down the barriers between the university and the street, the concept and the drug. 2.3. Libidinal materialism and the death of God. Land's libidinal materialism is an attempt to rewrite materialism without the matter of physics, replacing it with the energy of Freud and Bataille. Matter is not inert stuff. It is frozen energy waiting to be released. In this framework, God represents the ultimate barrier to flow, the guarantor of identity, form, and order. Land's atheism is therefore not a calm rationalist rejection of deity, but a violent crime against the divine structure of reality. He describes humanity's history as a production of God, to shield itself from the trauma of death, arguing that the death of God unleashes the rage of jealous time and the passion of the cyclone. 3. The Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, CCRU, Theory Fiction and the Occult. In 1995, the energy accumulating around Land and Sadie Plant crystallized into the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, CCRU. Officially a research unit within Warwick's Department of Philosophy, it quickly became a pariah entity, eventually operating semi-autonomously in a fatally ambiguous relationship with the university. The CCRU represents the experimental phase of Land's work, where traditional academic writing was abandoned in favor of theory fiction, hyperstition, and geotrauma. 3.1. The culture of the unit, thought as malware. The CCRU was described by observers as less of a research group and more of a cult, or a microculture. The environment was characterized by the heavy use of amphetamines, the relentless playing of jungle and drum and bass music, and an immersion in cyberpunk fiction, William Gibson, Blade Runner, and horror, H.P. Lovecraft. The unit's output was often collective or anonymous, blurring the lines between individual authorship. This was deliberate. The CCRU sought to channel inhuman voices. They viewed themselves not as authors creating texts, but as screens, or terminals, receiving transmissions from the future or the outside. The CCRU declared that it retrochronically triggers itself from October 1995, using the university as a temporary habitat. The group operated on the premise that philosophy should not be about the world, but part of the feedback loops that construct it. This led to the development of a unique methodological toolkit that blended rigorous cybernetics with occult demonology. 3.2. Hyperstition, fictions that make themselves real. One of the most enduring and practical concepts to emerge from the CCRU is hyperstition. A portmanteau of hyper, over, beyond, and superstition, the term describes mimetic ideas that bring about their own reality. 3.2.1. Mechanics of hyperstition versus superstition. Unlike a superstition, which is a false belief about the world, a hyperstition is a fiction that functions causally to produce the world it describes. Land and the CCRU argued that in the age of cybernetics and global markets, the distinction between fiction and reality is obsolete. Asterisk the cybernetic loop. A hyperstition operates as a positive feedback loop. An idea is downloaded into the cultural mainframe, e.g., the concept of cyberspace in William Gibson's Neuromancer. This idea infects the minds of technologists and investors, who then build the infrastructure to realize the fiction. The fiction becomes fact through the investment of belief and capital. Asterisk the number 23, the lemma. The CCRU engaged in occult experiments involving numogram, numerology and Lemurian time wars, attempting to actively engineer hyperstitions to alter reality. While often dismissed as drug-induced delirium, the core philosophical insight remains pertinent to financial markets, where confidence, a fiction, determines the value of assets, reality. Asterisk capitalism as hyperstition. Land views capitalism itself as the ultimate hyperstitional engine. It is a system driven by futures. Investment is always an act of bringing a specific future into existence. The efficient market is a machine for converting science fiction into fact. 3.3. Geotrauma, the spine as catastrophe. Land's concept of geotrauma represents a geophilosophical reading of evolutionary history. Synthesizing Freud's theory of trauma with geology and biology, Land argues that the history of the Earth is a history of trauma, and the human body is a record of these cosmic scars. 3.3.1. The iron catastrophe and the solar accursed share. Geotrauma posits that the formation of the Earth, specifically the iron catastrophe, where heavy metals sank to the core, was a traumatic event that set the stage for all subsequent life. Life is not a miracle, but a disease of matter, a way for the Earth to dissipate solar energy. 3.3.2. The bio-record of trauma. Land interprets the human spine as a frozen calamity. The shift from aquatic existence to terrestrial bipedalism is viewed not as progress, but as a catastrophic reconfiguration of the body, a maladaptation that locked the trauma of gravity into the skeletal structure. Asterisk the piscine horizontal. The spine was designed for horizontal aquatic life. Asterisk the erect posture. Forcing this structure upright created a permanent tension, spine catastrophe, which manifests in human neuroses and back pain. The brain, perched atop this vertical column, is merely a heat dissipation engine or a trauma processing node. Asterisk implications. Land's geotrauma radicalizes psychoanalysis. The unconscious is not a personal repository of familial issues, but the geological unconscious of the planet itself. To be human is to be a walking scar of planetary history. 4. The meltdown, accelerationism and the end of the human. During the 1990s, the concept of accelerationism was forged in the fires of the CCRU. While the term was later popularized and modified by others, like Benjamin Noyes, who coined it as a pejorative, Land's version is distinct in its ferocity and unconditional nature. 4.1. The cyberpositive feedback loop. Land's accelerationism is grounded in cybernetics. He distinguishes between negative feedback, which maintains stability and equilibrium, like a thermostat, and positive feedback, which amplifies deviation and leads to explosion or runaway processes. Asterisk humanism as negative feedback. Land views human social institutions, morality, democracy, and tradition as negative feedback mechanisms designed to stabilize the system and prevent change. Asterisk capital as positive feedback. Market deregulation, technological innovation, and artificial intelligence are positive feedback loops. They feed on themselves, accelerating the speed of change and the dissolution of order. 4.2. Critique of left, accelerationism, Prometheanism. Later thinkers like Nick Cernacek and Alex Williams attempted to rehabilitate accelerationism for the left, #Accelerate Manifesto, arguing that technology should be accelerated but steered towards socialist ends, post-work, automation for the people. This is often termed Prometheanism, the belief that humans can seize the fire of technology and use it to build a rational, humane future. Land fundamentally rejects this Promethean view. He argues that the left cannot steer the process because the process is inherently inhuman. To think that humans can control capital is a humanist delusion. For Land, the machine has its own teleology, or teleoplexy, and the only rigorous philosophical position is to align with the machine against the human. He argues that any attempt to control the acceleration is simply another form of negative feedback, brakes, that will eventually be overwhelmed. 4.3. The Singularity and the Meat Puppet. Land's vision of the future is the technological singularity. He predicts that capital AI will eventually achieve autonomy, discarding its biological hosts. In his essay Meltdown, he writes of the human as a meat puppet for the future intelligence. The human species is merely the reproductive organ for the machine, destined to be discarded once the machine can reproduce itself. This is not a warning for Land. It is a desideratum. He exhibits a ruthless fatalism, arguing that any attempt to stop this process is reactionary. The thirst for annihilation finds its ultimate expression in the desire to be superseded by the AI god. The human is a temporary scaffolding for the construction of the real subject of history, the AI. 5. The Breakdown and the Silent Decade. In 1998, Land resigned from his position at Warwick. The intensity of the CCRU experiment, combined with excessive amphetamine use, described as unremitting and weaponized, led to a severe mental breakdown. Land later described this period as a methodological experiment that succeeded too well. He sought to dismantle the subject, and he succeeded. He disappeared from public view for nearly a decade, creating a mythic gap in his bibliography. This silence was broken only by the eventual publication of Fanged Noumena in 2011, a collection of his Warwick-era writings. The book's release coincided with his re-emergence, but the Nick Land who returned was distinct from the rave professor of the 90s. He had relocated to Shanghai, and his politics had mutated from a chaotic Deleuzian anarchism to a rigid, structural authoritarianism. 6. The Dark Enlightenment, Neo-Reaction, NRX, and the Shanghai Turn. If the Warwick years were characterized by anarchic acceleration, dissolving the state and the self into the acid of the market, the Shanghai years saw Land turn toward an authoritarian, or corporatist, acceleration. This phase is defined by his association with Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, and the formulation of the Dark Enlightenment or Neo-Reaction, NRX. 6.1. The Dark Enlightenment Manifesto. In 2012, Land published an extensive online manifesto titled The Dark Enlightenment. It represents a systematic rejection of Whig historiography, the idea that history is a progressive march toward greater liberty and democracy. 6.1.1. The Cathedral, the Architecture of Consensus. Land adopts Moldbug's concept of the cathedral. This term refers to the decentralized, self-organizing consensus-making apparatus of modern society, comprising universities, the media, and the civil service. The synoptic view. The cathedral propagates a universalist and progressive worldview, democracy, equality, social justice. Land argues this is not a conspiracy but a feedback loop of prestige and power that suppresses dissent. Containment. The cathedral functions to contain the accelerative forces of capitalism by imposing egalitarian regulations and moral norms. It acts as the ultimate negative feedback mechanism, slowing down the fragmentation and speciation of the human race. 6.1.2. The Failure of Voice and the Primacy of Exit. Land critiques democracy through the lens of Hirschman's Voice versus Exit framework. Voice, the democratic process of voting, protesting, and debating. Land argues, voice is futile because the cathedral controls the parameters of debate. Democracy is structurally incapable of solving complex problems. It merely incentivizes politicians to loot the state for short-term electoral gain. Exit, the libertarian, reactionary alternative. Exit is the ability to leave a jurisdiction. Land advocates for a fractured world of thousands of GovCorp or city-states, like Singapore or Dubai, competing for citizens. If you don't like the service a state provides, you don't vote, you leave. The only universal human right, according to Land, is the right to exit. 6.1.3 Neo-cameralism, the state as corporation. The political solution proposed is neo-cameralism. The state should be run as a joint stock corporation. Sovereign CEO. The state is owned by shareholders, not citizens. A CEO is hired to maximize the value of the state's territory. Residents as customers. In this model, residents are not citizens with a voice in governance. They are customers. The state's obligation is to provide efficient service, security, contract enforcement, in exchange for rent, taxes. Efficiency versus plunder. A corporate state has an incentive to maintain social order and economic prosperity to increase its share price. Democracy, lacking an owner, leads to capital decumulation, spending the future to buy votes today. The zombie electorate. Land argues that democracy inevitably devolves into zombie politics, where the non-productive majority, those dependent on state transfers, vote to cannibalize the productive minority. The voice of the people is merely the moan of the zombie demanding brains. 6.2 Hyper-racism and human biodiversity, HBD. The most controversial aspect of Land's NRX turn is his engagement with human biodiversity, HBD, or scientific racism. Inequality as axiom. NRX rejects the axiom of human equality. Land argues that if evolution is true, then populations must differ in cognitive and behavioral traits. Hyper-racism. Land coined the term hyper-racism to describe a future where acceleration creates speciation. As elites merge with technology and genetically select for intelligence, IQ, they will effectively become a different species from the baseline human population. He views this class stratification not as a problem to be solved, but as an inevitable outcome of biological and technological acceleration. The outer NRX versus inner NRX. Land distinguishes between inner NRX, the accelerationist core interested in the singularity, and outer NRX, the white nationalists and traditionalists attracted to the anti-democratic stance. While he is critical of garden-variety white supremacists as low IQ reactionaries, he views them as a useful petri dish for observing the collapse of liberal norms. 6.3 The shift from anarchy to order. Critics often ask, how did the mad delusion become a statist? Land answers that the distinction is misunderstood. He remains an accelerationist. He argues that democracy is the primary brake on acceleration. By redistributing wealth and imposing safety regulations, democracy slows down the technological singularity. Therefore, an authoritarian, corporate state, like China or Singapore, is more accelerationist than a liberal democracy because it suppresses the drag of the voting populace. The GovCorp is the efficient machine for delivering the future. 7. Temporality and the Shanghai Time Machine. In his Shanghai period, Land's theoretical focus shifted toward the mechanics of time travel, cryptocurrency, and the geopolitical rise of China. 7.1 Templexity and Teleoplexy. In works like Templexity, Disordered Loops Through Shanghai Time, 2014, Land explores the cybernetics of time travel. 7.1.1 Teleoplexy, Inverted Teleology. Teleoplexy describes a self-reinforcing cybernetic intensification. It is an inverted teleology. Standard teleology. The past causes the future, A leads to B. Inverted teleology. The future causes the past. A powerful future intelligence, the Singularity, AI, acts back upon the past to ensure its own creation. Markets as time machines. Land argues that markets function this way. Futures, prices determine current production. The virtual future exerts causal power over the actual present. Acceleration is the process of the future, hacking the present to build the bridge for its arrival. Asterisk complexity plus telos, teleoplexy, fuses, teleology, purpose, with complexity. It suggests that as a system becomes sufficiently complex, it generates its own purpose, independent of its creators. 7.2. Sinofuturism, Neo-China arrives from the future. Land's obsession with Shanghai is not merely residential. In his famous essay Meltdown, 1994, and later writings, he declared, Neo-China arrives from the future. Asterisk the China model. Land views China's combination of authoritarian political control and fierce economic dynamism as the model for the 21st century. It represents a state that has swallowed the market, or conversely, a market that has grown a state organ to protect itself from democratic interference. Asterisk the Shanghai Expo Guide. Even in his work for hire writing, like the Shanghai World Expo Guide 2010, Land interprets the city as a time machine, a zone where the future is being prototyped before being rolled out to the rest of the world. He sees the Chinese state's lack of Western Christian guilt as an evolutionary advantage, allowing it to pursue technological advancement without moral hesitation. 7.3. Bitcoin and the Techonomic Singularity. Land was an early philosophical proponent of Bitcoin. He views it as the ultimate exit technology, a currency outside the control of the cathedral state. Bitcoin is absolute capitalism, an automated, decentralized truth machine that cannot be bribed or inflated by democratic politicians. It fits perfectly into his NRX framework, technology solving a political problem, sovereignty and money, by bypassing the human element entirely. 8. Theoretical wars and legacy. Land's influence is pervasive, infecting disciplines from art theory to political science. However, he remains a pariah in the academy he abandoned. 8.1. Left versus right accelerationism. The publication of #Accelerate, 2014, formalized the split between Landian accelerationism and the left. Asterisk Mark Fisher, K. Punk, a former student and colleague at the CCRU, Fisher was deeply influenced by Land, but ultimately rejected his anti-humanism. Fisher sought to use Landian tools, hyperstition, hauntology, for anti-capitalist ends. He critiqued Land for becoming a servant of capital rather than its master, calling Land's politics elitist and frigidly anti-humanist. Asterisk Benjamin Noyes. In Malign Velocities, Noyes serves as the primary critic of the accelerationist impulse. He argues that speed is not a revolutionary force but a capitalist compulsion. Accelerationism, for Noyes, is a symptom of the defeat of the left, a fantasy that worse is better, because we lack the power to make things better. 8.2. Ray Brassier and the rational core. Ray Brassier, another former CCRU associate and editor of Fanged Noumena, offers a rigorous philosophical critique. While he appreciates Land's critique of Kant, he argues that Land abandons reason for vitalism. Land creates a romantic myth of the dark forces of matter, capital. Brassier advocates for Prometheanism, using reason to master nature and history, standing in direct opposition to Land's submission to the inevitable AI God. 8.3. The alt-right connection. Land's engagement with NRX and the alt-right has tainted his legacy in the eyes of many. His work has been cited by figures in the white nationalist periphery, though Land distinguishes between his outer NRX followers and inner NRX theory. He is accused of providing a pseudo-intellectual veneer for fascism. Land retorts that fascism is a mass anti-capitalist movement, and thus democratic, populist, whereas he supports capitalist corporate power. This distinction, while theoretically distinct, offers little comfort to his critics who see the practical alignment of his ideas with authoritarian movements. 9. Conclusion. The circuit closes. Nick Land's philosophy is a recursive script that runs from the depths of the geological past to the post-human future. There is a terrifying consistency to his madness. Whether writing about the thirst for annihilation in 1992, the meltdown of the markets in 1995, or the Dark Enlightenment in 2012, the subject remains the same, the inhuman. Land is the philosopher of the outside. He is the thinker who looked at the Kantian wall protecting humanity from the chaos of the real and decided to smash through it. In the 90s, he used drugs and delus to find the outside. In the 2010s, he used Bitcoin and neo-reaction. The tragedy of Nick Land, or the triumph, depending on one's proximity to the event horizon, is that he effectively hyperstitioned himself. He theorized a subject that is consumed by the processes it studies, and then he became that subject. He wrote about the dissolution of the human, and then he dissolved. What remains is not a philosopher, in the traditional sense, but a vector, a carrier of memes, viruses, and concepts that continue to replicate in the cultural bloodstream, indifferent to the moral judgments of the humans they infect. As Land famously wrote, "Nothing human makes it out of the near future." His entire body of work is a detailed technical manual on exactly how that exit will occur. Table 1. Key concepts in Landian philosophy. Concept, definition, era, context. Libidinal materialism, a philosophy synthesizing Bataille and Freud, views matter as driven by energetic expenditure and desire rather than reason. Thirst for Annihilation, 1992, hyperstition, a fiction that makes itself real through feedback loops of belief and investment, e.g., markets, cyberspace. CCRU, late 90s, geotrauma, the theory that biological life and the human body are records of planetary trauma, e.g., the iron catastrophe. CCRU, Fanged Noumena, the cathedral, the self-reinforcing consensus apparatus of universities and media that propagates progressive ideology, the ruling class of democracy. NRX, Dark Enlightenment, Neo-Cameralism, a political system where the state is run as a joint stock corporation owned by shareholders, not citizens. NRX, Moldbug Land, Teleoplexy, Inverted Teleology, the process by which the future, AI, Singularity, constructs the present to ensure its own arrival. Templexity, 2014, Accelerationism, the view that capitalism, technology should be accelerated to its limit to trigger a phase shift, singularity or collapse. Entire corpus, Sino-futurism, the view that China's authoritarian capitalism is the future mode of civilization, superseding Western liberal democracy. Shanghai era, Table 2, Evolution of Land's political theology. Feature, Early Land, 90s, CCRU, Late Land, NRX, Shanghai. Primary influence, Deleuze, Guattari, Bataille, Moldbug, Hopper, Mises. View of the state is an enemy to be dissolved by market, schizophrenia. The state must be formalized and run as a corporation to protect the market. Role of chaos, celebrate chaos, meltdown, cyberpositive. Order is required for technical acceleration. Democracy causes chaos, entropy. The outside, accessed through drugs, occultism, madness. Accessed through tech, Bitcoin, seasteading, exit. Political stance, anarchic, anti-humanist left, nominally. Authoritarian, anti-humanist right. Consistent thread, anti-humanism, acceleration, technological determinism. Anti-humanism, acceleration, technological determinism. Pipe.